today with Merilee Karr, who is the CEO and founder of Under the Doormat Group in the UK, and also the former chairperson of the Short-Term Rental Accommodation Association in the UK. Welcome, Merilee.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, before we talk about short-term rental regulations in the UK, why don't you tell us a bit about Under the Doormat and where it fits into the vacation rental scene?
So, Under the Doormat Group is an end-to-end short-term rental company. We operate under our brands Vive and Under the Doormat. We are a PMS system with our Hosperia technology. And we also operate on behalf of the industry, Trusted Stays, which is a platform enabling all professional operators to gain access to the corporate and government markets. So we work at all parts of the value chain and often work with institutional real estate or individual operators, supporting them in getting the value out of short-term rentals.
Great. Okay, thank you. So now if we talk about the proposed short-term rental regulations or the latest proposed regulations from the UK government, can you tell us the key aspects? I think there are two key components to these proposed regulations. And so let's start with that.
Absolutely. So the two key proposals on the table are for a national registration system and for planning regulation. And I'll start first with registration, because this is something that's been on the table actually for many years. And as an industry, we always supported the implementation of a national registration system. However, we support that, or have always supported it, under certain conditions. It needs to be a single national registration system, not something which is devolved down to local councils and turning out to be different across different geographies. It needs to be low cost or ideally free. And it needs to be a declaratory system, meaning that you declare that you're doing the activity and you get a registration number, not something where you have to go through a bureaucratic process. Our goal is, with a national registration system, that we would get the data to debunk myths, to really understand and have the evidence base around what contribution the industry is making in the UK, but also where there are issues that arise, to be able to use data to really understand them and understand any further regulatory mechanics that might need to be put in place to ensure the right balance. Now, that is what the government is currently proposing, is along those lines. However, it is, of course, unclear what the final registration system might look like. And of course, at the moment, there's a lot of movement in UK government and talk of when the next election will be, etc. So the real question is whether this registration system will be legislated either prior to or not the next election. Our hope is that genuinely this is a positive step for the industry and that it will get legislated so that everyone has the clarity of what that registration system will look like for the future.
Okay, so that's the registration part. And so the devil is in the detail, but basically in broad terms, it could be a positive for the industry as well.
Absolutely. I think it is absolutely the right step to have data that supports our industry and that actually we are transparent as an industry, and therefore we can be counted, we can be valued, and also we can be very much seen in the open as a regulated industry that people respect, which I think is incredibly important. Second piece is planning. And this is a lot trickier because what this is essentially saying is that they would create a new planning class for short-term rentals. And while there are a number of nuances around it, like Article 4 directions, where a local authority would have to get permission to start restricting the number of short-term rentals in a particular area, and what's called permitted development rights, where people could move between planning classes. So move between a residential planning class and, for example, a short-term rental planning class. But fundamentally, planning is a blunt mechanism. I am not an advocate for planning as a solution in driving the right regulatory outcomes. However, if planning were to come in, I think the key aspect that is critical is that any Article 4 directions, for example, would have to be evidence-based using a registration system, so that you don't end up in a world where you have NIMBYs across the country who are essentially, or politicians who are using it as a political tool to crack down on the industry unnecessarily and without a data-based evidence that drives those decisions. So I think, we've seen what's happened in Scotland, where licensing has come in and where local councils are coming in with a very hard hammer. And we see the negative impact that that's having on tourism to Scotland. I don't want that to happen for other parts of the UK. And so I think my ideal would be that they realize that planning is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And therefore, this is not the route to go down in terms of solving the challenges that our industry faces. And that actually the focus would be very much on registration, data collection, and evidence base prior to any further regulations being put in place down the line. Whether that happens, don't know. The planning side is a little bit less far along in the thinking from government. So it is likely that registration might come ahead of planning in the legislative agenda. But how these things materialize in the coming months, to be honest, is anyone's guess. So, our goal, certainly when I was chairing the Short-Term Accommodation Association, was to make sure that we are involved in all of those discussions. And I know the team are continuing to do that. So I think that is one to stay posted to really understand what those implications will look like.
Okay. And so what is the process? What would be sort of the next steps? What happens next?
To be honest, we have to wait and hear from government what those timings will look like. So that is definitely the next step. I think the next step, if you're an operator, as we are, is absolutely make sure you are a member of the association and you are getting all the updates about what's happening. And I would also say, get involved in terms of going and speaking to your own MPs, because once this stuff comes into Parliament, there's a very short time frame to do anything to influence it. So we should all be working really hard, not just at a national level, at the association level, but all of us in our local jurisdictions, to make sure that our MPs are educated, that they understand the value our sector brings, and that when this legislation comes, they know what the right choices are to make.
So no, let's put it this way: in terms of impact or potential impact on the actual business of the man on the ground, how could these proposed regulations, as they stand at the moment, then potentially impact the businesses, and what should operators do other than advocacy, of course, and getting involved to prepare their business strategies and so on?
Well, I mean, look, again, none of these things would have an impact on day one, because the proposals as they stand mean that owners would be able to move back and forth between planning classes. There wouldn't be any Article 4 directions from day one. So there would not be any new restrictions essentially from day one. And with grandfathering, that means anyone who's operating a business today, those properties would automatically have the ability to be classified. So there's no short-term doomsday scenario based on the current form of these proposals. However, over time, certain areas where there is a housing crisis, where there is a demonstrable large portion of properties in short-term rentals, might find those areas having Article 4 directions come into place. And that might restrict the future growth in those areas. But again, as long as grandfathering still exists, it wouldn't necessarily take your business backwards.
And what about entering the industry at this point? Is this something that you would recommend? How do you think it would impact the number of people coming into the industry?
Well, look, that depends on what level you're talking about. If somebody is talking about launching a new business and your goal is to have 500 properties in your portfolio in the next 2 to 3 years, now might not be the best time, but I'm not sure that's wholly driven by regulation. That's also driven by the fact that there are already a lot of operators in the market, that we are post the post-COVID boom and the market is softening. So I wouldn't say that regulation is the reason to launch in the market or not launch in the market today. I would say there are a lot more broader market factors which probably make it a less attractive market to be a brand new entrant than several years ago. But of course, again, it depends. If you're an individual host looking to rent out your property, I don't think that it's a bad time to do that if you have the right property in the right location and you're able to provide the right services. So, again, it depends on what size, what order of magnitude, and what you're trying to achieve.
And I think, as you said last time, there may be opportunities in terms of merging with existing operations as well. So looking at those kind of opportunities as opposed to maybe starting out something yourself.
Absolutely. And I mean, you also see there are some people who've been in the industry for a number of years who might be looking to step out. So I would say rather than just setting up something brand new, you might want to explore, are there other ways to enter the market, either partnering, getting involved in businesses that already exist, all these types of things. So, I would say there are absolutely market opportunities. The question is finding the right one, given the stage of maturity of the market, and of course the external environment that we're in terms of demand.
Well, how fair in terms of, are they only focused on the short-term rental part of the market and not, are they taking into account the wider hospitality environment? That's the one part, and then the other part is, are they likely to achieve the results that the government is using as motivation, which is helping to address the housing crisis or the lack of supply of housing in tourist areas?
Yeah. So look, I think that there's two things obviously in that question, and the first one is what are their objectives? So the government's objectives in most cases, and this isn't unique to the UK, are that they want to get the balance right between housing and, of course, tourism and short-term rental demand. But of course, there are different mechanics that you can use to achieve that. So I think registration broadly, I think across the industry is viewed as a positive step because it gets visibility. We're able to see the value that the sector is driving and all of those things. Where when you start implementing things like planning, what you're doing is actually restricting the sector. And of course, it is always important to understand the different dynamics because yes, there are properties that are done 365 days a year, which are kind of holiday lets or short-term rentals on a semi-permanent basis. But actually, quite a lot of our industry is made up of primary and secondary homeowners. And just because they're rented out as a short-term rental does not mean that it takes the property off the housing market, because of course someone lives in that property for part of the year anyway. And so I think what's critical for regulators is making sure that what they don't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that means actually taking away those peak supply properties from the market when actually it doesn't create any single additional extra homes. And in fact, creates a different problem, which is, of course, that in many places where short-term rentals and holiday rentals exist, we as an industry create employment and create spend in those local areas, which otherwise might not exist. And so it's really important to make sure that that the regulations are there achieving the things that they're set out to do from a policy point of view. Then I think it is looking at the regulations that are proposed here in the UK. And I think the registration system does help. But if we are talking about the planning legislation, I think the planning class is actually potentially being proposed for the wrong thing. If you would put planning on second home ownership, then of course that already starts to address a different point, which is, as soon as a home goes from being a full-time home for someone to reside in to a second home, that is the point when the house usage has changed.
Mhm.
And the worst thing that can happen is you have a lot of empty second homes. The fact that a second home is rented out means that you have 6 times more income and value coming into that local community than an empty second home. So my view is that the planning class should not be on short-term rentals or the activity of renting it out, but should rather, if a planning class is necessary at all, be on the fact that a home has become a second home and therefore not a primary residence in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And so I think so we kind of addressed the first part. What about the kind of fairness in terms of the whole across the hospitality sector?
Well, so look, again, different markets approach this in different ways. So Wales, for example, is looking at how they can do it across the broader sector. In England, they are looking at registration just for short-term rentals. My view is that if you're going to look at things broadly, it's helpful to get the data across the entire sector and not just one segment of the market. So I think where you are having national registration systems, it's helpful to do that in a consistent way across the entire hospitality sector. However, you then move into the next step, or one of the other things that regulators often try and solve, and that can be health and safety and standards. And I think there is, on the flip side, a risk that you would end up potentially with disproportionate health and safety regulations when you're applying the same standards across the whole of the hospitality sector. Because, of course, if a home is safe for a tenant or a renter to live in for a year, that home is probably, I would argue, safe for someone to stay in for a week. But of course, when you've got F&B and you've got restaurants and you've got swimming pools, that's where often in the hospitality sector, the health and safety risks sit. And so I think there is a cautionary tale around bundling everything in hospitality together, that you still need to make sure that you've got proportionate regulations in health and safety, and that you're not applying something to a hotel occupied by hundreds of people to a home where a couple of guests are staying. Because I don't think that actually is justified, or indeed that there's evidence to prove that that's required.
I've got another question in terms of you've referred to the political environment. And so obviously the uncertainty in the political environment in the UK could impact on how and whether the regulations come into place. But just as someone not living in the UK, are there similar approaches or an attitude towards short-term rentals across the political parties or spectrum in the UK?
Yes, and look, to be perfectly honest, I don't think the UK is unique. Across the world, what we're seeing is political parties recognizing that housing is an issue which wins votes,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore looking for ways to show to the electorate that you are taking housing seriously and helping people get onto the housing ladder is something that wins votes. And so, you see that across the board in places like Portugal, where there's been a really a difficult political environment in cracking down on short-term rentals. But, I think in almost every jurisdiction, there are examples where this is happening. And so I think for us as an industry, the key is how we demonstrate our responsible growth, and how we ensure that with better data from things like registration, etc., that we can debunk the myths and take away this kind of anecdotal evidence of a bus driver who can't get a place to live, or all these types of things, and we can use data to demonstrate the value that our sector drives, and also the fact that it is a drop in the ocean. Now, I think what is important is that you also will even find politicians, and I've spoken to some myself, who recognize that the real problem of housing is that not enough homes are being built. And that is true in almost every geography. And so, of course, the challenge that we then have as an industry is, of course, it's much easier to say we're going to crack down on short term rentals than it is to build those much needed new homes, and
Mm-hmm.
especially affordable homes. And so that is a dilemma that's not going to go away.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important that we use that data, we use that evidence, and we fight with facts, as well as stories of how actually our industry is helping people to afford their homes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think the more that people can actually understand the value that we bring to affordability, the better chance we have to change the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. Okay, any other lessons we can learn from short-term rental regulations implemented elsewhere in other cities or other jurisdictions?
Well, look, I think the biggest positive move forward at the moment is what's going on in Europe and with the European Commission, where they are coming together and landing on a regulatory environment which will be driven by registration and data sharing, which again I think could potentially be a very strong framework for Europe for the future and help to actually avoid some of the situations where you have cities like Barcelona or Brussels or Palma or all the list of cities that we all know, that are cracking down with heavy-handed regulations, which are probably in most cases not justified and not evidence-based. And so I think having that European framework would be a massive step forward for us as an industry and hopefully serve as an example to other markets on how you get the balance right.
Perfect.
One final thing is, I've been doing some work in the Middle East and looking at how also technology can be part of the solution for regulation and actually can help us as an industry to avoid overregulation. Because if we are able to use data that exists in the systems that our industry already uses, to help governments feel that our sector is transparent, to demonstrate that our sector meets certain standards, if we take the lead and we help governments to access this information and to be transparent as a sector, I think that puts us in a much stronger position to avoid that natural crackdown when all of a sudden, growth in the sector starts to lead to discontent.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you can help governments be ahead of that curve and already have a balanced regulatory framework right from the outset. So I'm very positive in how technology in our industry can help with that. I think there's great examples where companies like Minute are working with governments to show how noise detection can be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
Our Hosperia technology is working with governments and helping them to understand how they can have that data layer and understand the activity going on in markets. And there are other solutions out there, like quality assurance and quality accreditation, that again help on the standard side. So I think we have the solutions as an industry.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'd like to see is that we get ahead of regulators by supporting them to have the right frameworks so they don't need to come in with over-regulation, as a kind of bounce back or a result of things, in their view, getting out of control.
Mm-hmm. No, that's brilliant. So thank you very much. That's been a very insightful. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.